I want to focus on Ukraine because, of course, as you say, you're both here in the capacity of business leaders, but you've also been instrumental in shaping the message of the administration. You talked about Europeans, and Europeans are concerned that Ukraine is going to be abandoned. Are those fears valid?
I don't think Ukraine is going to be abandoned, but I think for years, again, it was the same thing as the last answer, which is, well, we want to attack Russia. We want to do this. Well, when it comes to actually writing a check ourselves, no, the U.S. is going to do it. The American public doesn't have an appetite for that. Since the invasion of Ukraine, I heard major leaders, Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate in the United States, saying, it's the #1 issue for Republicans in the United States. And I say, that's weird. I speak to Republicans all over the country every day, probably far more than Mitch has ever spoken to, despite his 379-year career in politics. I did that on a weekly basis, and I surveyed people at every talk I did. It got to the point where it was probably well over 200,000 Americans that I spoke to directly. And I'd be in a room like this, and I'd ask, is Russia-Ukraine a top 3 issue for anyone in the room? Nothing. Is it a top 10 issue for anyone in the room? I think I got 3 people that once said it was a top 10 issue. 3 out of hundreds surveyed, hundreds of thousands, every weekend for 2 years, till basically through the campaign. One person misunderstood the question. He thought it was a double negative. One person was actually from Kyiv, so he was like, it was a big deal for him. And the other person was, I think on the board of Raytheon. So there was no appetite for that, but that didn't stop a Republican Party from saying it's the #1 issue. It's not, and we actually have to listen to the will of those people. So we want peace, we want to stop the death, but I even saw that yesterday where, on this very stage, what was the idea for Europe, who is on the border of Ukraine, who has much more at stake if this happens? Well, our plan is to win economically when pressed on the issue. How are you going to do that? Well, we're just going to wait for Russia to go bankrupt. That's not a plan. That's not an idea. The gentleman from Spain was a lovely guy. I saw him last night later on at the Forum, but Spain was putting in 2.2% rather than the 5% required by NATO, because my father actually wanted people who are the biggest stakeholders to get into the game. Well, we feel that our 2.2% is being utilized more efficiently, and therefore we're not. That's not an answer. That's not a solution. And again, I understand why they are there, because America has set a precedent for decades that they'll just write the check. But if the will of the people isn't there, everyone needs to step up. Everyone has to do their share. And that includes what's happening here in the Middle East. If we do that collectively, we can get to an answer. But if we default to the old ways of America's just going to be the big idiot with a checkbook, that's not going to work. That's not going to happen. And you saw what happened. When my father starts threatening they're going to pull out, we're not going to do this anymore, because he's listening to the people that elected him to office, the whole world, this is outrageous. It's not outrageous. It's common sense. When we're bombing drug boats in the Caribbean, people who are literally bringing in fentanyl to America, something that kills 100,000 Americans a year. Okay, just for perspective, that's 2 Vietnam Wars a year in America. The neocon establishment, the Democrats, how dare you do this? I mean, that's a far greater, clear and present danger to the United States than anything going on in Ukraine and Russia, and yet they're against it. Think of the insanity of that. So my father has a common sense approach to everything. That's because rather than being a lifelong bureaucrat who's never actually done anything in the real world, he has, and he understands what that means, and we have to act accordingly.
Yeah, so I just want to say one thing on that. Going back to the gentlelady that spoke yesterday, I think she had a Freudian slip, at least I hope it was one, where she talked about what we did to the Russians in Afghanistan. That's not a great comp, by the way. Okay, that's a horrible comp. What we were doing, we're funding a mujahideen that create radicalization in that country, and we know what we reaped after that. I'm a business person, I look at this. We've spent almost $300 billion over there, and now we find out that Zelensky's #2 is under investigation for corruption. Where's the audit of where any of that money went? We should be asking those questions. We have over 300,000 people dead. It doesn't make sense as the United States to have enemies in both Russia, China, and then also add Iran in there. So from a strategic standpoint, again, speaking as a private citizen, my sense is you should act as a reverse Kissinger, neutralize the Russians, and then focus on the real threat that nobody seems to want to talk about except his dad, who started the conversation, that China is the one that you need to focus on.
One of the most amazing things I got to witness, I was this summer with my beautiful girlfriend Bettina in Monaco. and we were driving around, and on an average day, 50% of the supercars, the Bugattis, the Ferraris, the this, all had Ukrainian plates. Do we think that was actually earned in Ukraine? I'd been to Ukraine 20 years ago. It wasn't like there was a plethora of wealth there. And yet, you see the number two there getting arrested for stealing hundreds of millions of dollars. You hear all the rumors about what's going on. When I see every license plate on a supercar in Monaco being Bugattis, the rich fled. They let what they believed to be the peasant class fight these wars. And there was no incentive to stop, because as long as the money train was coming and they were stealing it and no one was auditing anything, the leaders, the decision makers, there was no reason for them to ever come to peace. No different than Putin. It wasn't the son of oligarchs that were fighting these wars. It's someone from Siberia that they're sending there. And he utilized the war to rebuild his manufacturing base. It was very clear that the sanctions that we put on did nothing to actually help. All it did was jack up the price of oil, which allowed him to basically pay for the war with the delta between the two while building up his manufacturing base. There was no incentive for anyone to ever get to the table. Zelensky knew he wouldn't win another election again, and they were continuing to steal. Putin was building up his manufacturing base, and all we had in the wake was millions of young men dying for nothing.
I mean, obviously, Ukraine has a massive corruption issue, and as you say,
it was a far more corrupt country than Russia, as delegated by the United States government prior to this war. But then, because of the war, and because he's one of the great marketers of all time, Zelensky became a borderline deity, especially to the left, where he could do no wrong. He was beyond reproach. Years of corruption, years of graft and theft on a world stage that everyone in this room knew was happening, was totally absolved. And it's ridiculous. We're not dealing in reality.
But is your hunch that President Trump is going to walk away?
I think he may. What's good about my father and what's unique about my father is you don't know what he's going to do. The fact that he's not predictable, he's not following the playbook of every clown who's, again, been a bureaucrat for decades, you don't know. And so that forces everyone to actually deal in an intellectually honest capacity, which has not happened in far too long.